Hello, I'm Mark Anderson. Welcome to the second edition of Stop the Presses, a periodic exploratory news program that cuts to the heart of issues often overlooked by mainstream and even by some alternative news outlets. While mainstream news is sometimes fake, misleading, unreliable, and shallow, I aim to take on challenging issues that are either totally ignored, downplayed, or mishandled. Having been a journalist for 33 years, I've covered local, provincial, and national issues and international issues in the US, Canada, the UK, and beyond, including Capitol Hill, where I'm credentialed to cover the U.S. Congress. Today, for the second edition, here in June 2018, I welcome John Devine, a longtime former business owner, activist, and alternative media co-editor with The Awakening News, an online publication based in Ontario, Canada. Thanks for being with me, John.
Thank you for inviting.
Great. Now, there's some very interesting issues, but first I'm going to show here on the screen the front page of Awakening News. And this here is one of your most recent editions, and you'll notice the headline, Closed Government Fostering the Loss of Public Power. Now, we won't get into that issue right now, but we'll talk about that later, as there's going to be two editions of Stop the Presses covering the Awakening News and some of your issues, John, this being the first of the two. Now, the issues here, we're going to talk about groundwater and some of those matters, and I know that's kind of one of your bellwether issues. We often hear about fracking. It's an invasive tool of the oil industry. It decimates subsurface soils and rock structures. It degrades and pollutes groundwater and things like that. But you have found, John, other things that threaten subsurface water, and we do, hear about now and then that as we live in concrete jungles, as we build up urban areas, we have less and less porous land, and this porous land gets paved over, and therefore, as we get less rainfall and less seepage into the ground, that the aquifers suffer. But what you've learned in your years as a businessman and as a journalist and citizen activist, John, there's much more that contributes to the degradation of the quality and quantity of groundwater. And I believe that we also have a slide here about the 11 cities most likely to run out of drinking water. And those cities are Sao Paulo, Bangalore, Beijing, Cairo, Jakarta, Moscow, even London, Istanbul, Mexico City, Tokyo, and Miami. And we've also heard, John, from your writings and articles in the Awakening News about Coca-Cola bottling plants hammering groundwater in drought-prone areas in India, and in Nestle near you in Guelph, Ontario, and I've seen in Evart, Michigan, the water bottlers in such as Nestle in Michigan and in Ontario taking huge amounts of water out of the aquifers. What did you learn, John, before we get into fishing farms and fisheries and fish hatcheries and things that are unbeknownst to most people in terms of how they affect groundwater? What did you learn about the amount of money Nestle spends to take to take water out of the Guelph aquifer?
Well, $3.71 per million liter is definitely alarming. And I think the bigger problem is a lack of response from any political parties, any politician, as to say, is this really a fair price? I mean, we're talking clean groundwater, the most valuable asset of water on the planet. And yet we keep bringing the issue up, concerned about the value, concerned about over mining of the planet's aquifers, and all we get is silence.
Yeah, and I recall when I went to visit you and Mark Devine, your son, and we were talking over these issues, we had met someone that said in British Columbia, if memory serves, that the water bottlers mine the groundwater, the aquifers for even less than $3.71 per million liters. That's incredible. Do you remember the figure offhand?
I'm sorry, I can't remember that one, but I do know that this is just one of many sectors that we have to look at in regards to reducing the overmining of the planet's aquifers, whether it be Guelph, Ontario, or India, or Coca-Cola is. It's just insanity at its best.
Very interesting. Now, let's go back to Fisherman's Cove. This is sort of the bellwether issue for you, John, as I've learned, as I've gotten to know you and looked over your issues and studied these things. Fisherman's Cove cold water fisheries back in the early 90s. This is what really brought the issue home. not just, of course, groundwater issues, but the destruction of a business that you ran, and that business contained the technology to solve a large part of this groundwater threat. Take us back to what happened then.
Well, we identified. I graduated in resource management and moved to the private sector with strong financing from my aunt, and we identified the overmining of the planet's groundwater to hatch fish, and that takes us into a bigger picture that's not well described to the public. The footprint of fish farms right now, most people are identifying itself with the grow-out facilities, and it is a concern about pollution on the coastlines and whatnot like that. But what's constantly never talked about is the amount of groundwater required to raise fish that go to the grow-out facilities. They call them cages along the coastlines to grow to food size, or the farming of fish using groundwater to stock fish in the lakes, rivers, and streams. And so what we did, we went to the University of Guelph and obtained some technology in regards to a closed system to hold. We started off just with the little bait and tackle shop we bought and installed a closed system. From there, we realized the capabilities and capacity of the closed system. 15 miles from the little retail and bait shop, we built cold water fisheries. And from there, we made it successful, survived in the free market, and we were only using 10% of the groundwater that other hatcheries have been using. The problem is that we cannot get anybody to tell us whether this technology has where it's at, because we're talking, we are into our fourth decade of trying to find out whether there's a second generation of groundwater. Now, I'll take you back to the little bait and tackle shop where it first started. We were going along quite well until the government identified that they needed a part of the little business to help Casino Rama succeed. And in the expropriation, which was a total debacle, they seized half the property, put a highway across the face of it, destroying one business, destroying half of our parking, removing the entrances. And then they came back and said there will be no compensation to rebuild on the property not expropriated. You'll have to do that on your own. So we lost the little bait and tackle shop. Underneath that, there was corruption at Bay Street with a money manager that stole money from our family, and that's another story in its own right. So what we stayed constant was that this worked at the start of the little bait and tackle shop, using the intellectual property of the University of Guelph. It really works. And now all of a sudden, in the last 6 months, there's a major push in the media in regards to removing the cage facilities and building inland facilities using the closed system to make up for the shortfalls of the oceans right now.
Very interesting. In other words, what you found, and I recall this from talking to you in person and in subsequent conversations, what you found was you suspect that the amount of groundwater, aquifer water being mined out of the earth to raise a pound's worth of fish is an extremely high number, because you and your son, Mark, have run into one brick wall after another, being stonewalled constantly when you call academic institutions, government agencies, private agencies. No matter where you call, they don't want to tell you how much water it takes through the flow-through systems, unlike yours, which is a contained recycling system, to use far less water. In the flow-through systems, where there's a lot of groundwater waste and a lot of pollution, a pollution factor of like 20,000 people, they don't want to tell you the amount of water being used. Now, how high did you suspect that amount might be, the amount of water it takes to raise a pound's worth of fish?
Well, first of all, we got our information from one of the employees we hired at Cold Water Fisheries, and basically that came from the fish hatchery section of the Ontario government. They're currently using 2,000 gallons a minute of clean groundwater to operate the average fish hatchery, and I found that to be constant across North America. And the problem there is that people cannot understand until you look at it from a different perspective. National Geographic says it takes like 1,799 gallons to raise a pound of beef. And the National Geographic has broken out 17 different foods, that the amount of water consumed to do it. We're asking how many gallons of water is required, groundwater is required to raise 1 pound of fish in a fish hatchery. And that one we've taken around the country to states and provinces and whatnot like that, and nobody's talking. And nobody came back and confirmed that, yes, we now are moved into the closed system. So after decades of pursuing the issue, we definitely have the feeling that we're not ready to advance the closed system as we would like to take the pressure off the cages in the oceans. It all boils down to government silence.
And you were telling me off the air that you have to have groundwater in hatcheries, correct? Because of temperature factors.
Yeah, there's several factors. Clean groundwater, surface water, by and large, you get pollutants in it from the air, whatever, artificial fertilizers, chemicals. It's just hard to find. And another troubling thing trying to use surface water in a fish hatchery is variance in temperatures. So it's just too risky and it's never successful. You have to draw groundwater out of the ground and use it.
Yeah, so because some people might argue, well, the hatcheries don't always use groundwater, they might use surface water. Of course, today's surface water is tomorrow's groundwater, depending on how porous the soil is, and I talked about those factors earlier. But what I'm getting at, and what's really important for listeners to take into account here, is while fracking degrades underground water supplies, so too does the overmining of aquifers in other sectors. And I think you said, John, correct me if I'm wrong, that the huge Ogallala aquifer, one of the world's great aquifers that is underneath 7 states, mostly Nebraska, could be losing from various sources, bottlers, irrigation, the entire 9 yards, could be losing, or at least being hammered, 60 million gallons a day. Was that not the prediction?
Well, yeah, and I just carved that 60 million gallons out of the number of fish farms we calculated that are operating and drawing from the Ogallala. That doesn't include irrigation for farms and whatnot like that. And again,
so it might be even worse. Yes.
Oh, I think big time for sure. You got to remember the Ogallala was in 1930. I think it was like the size of 9.5 Lake Erie's, and now it's shrunk down to 4.5 to 5, according to all the data we can gather. So, you know, they're at the critical point here of where are we going to go with this? And we've even coined the slogan, like, how low will the wells go before the banker says no? And all the sectors have got to get better at what we're doing in managing our groundwater.
Let's look at that headline. How low will the wells go? That is a very critical question. There it is, an article you ran in an Awakening News publication, must have been a year and a half, 2 years ago. How low will the wells go before the bankers say no? If you would, John, explain the meaning behind that question.
Well, all farms and whatnot, like any businesses and whatnot, finance with banks more often than not, and they amortize the financing. So I can't really see a bank going to amortize a loan for 20 years if they find out there's only 15 years of groundwater left. So the banker's going to say no here, and as time moves on, the amortization period continues to shrink.
What I would add is that any credit-dependent business that uses water, some sort of energy concern, some sort of environmental business, nonprofit business, any kind of farmer, up to and including fish hatcheries, without proper water supplies, and if we do have a big loss in the capacity and quality of our groundwater, then credit could dry up just as the water dries up, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And you know, you wonder what's going on in Cape Town with the bankers over there, with the scarcity of water and whatnot. I'd be hard pressed to think that they haven't started to factor in the shortage of water, being that the taps are dry right now.
Yeah, that's a very critical question. As we have money drought, we have water drought, and vice versa. A very interesting and unanticipated thing, I would add. Well, John, it's certainly interesting to go over this, and I want to repeat that for the listeners that might not have totally processed that figure earlier. The Nestle company, that wonderful maker of candies and food products and bottled water and many a thing, gets groundwater out of Guelph, Ontario for $3.71 per million liters. And I believe that it's a 3,000% markup when you buy a bottle of water, at least a 3,000% markup. Well, moving on, there's a number of other things to consider. Now, there are some definite solutions, and this is one of the things that I know that you were very concerned and disappointed about when Fisherman's Cove was bulldozed under that tyrannical act in the early 90s to make room for widening a road for a casino, and that's Casino Rama, and that's a whole nother story. But you had a real solution in hand for a problem that is just now coming to a head. We've seen at least 10, 11 cities looking at water shortages. We've seen extended drought in California and Arizona. And yet we hear, and there's a number of things I could say here, we hear that even though California, especially Southern California and its border with Arizona, are often drought prone, sometimes to the point of California having widespread deadly fires, yet we hear that Saudi Arabia and China are opening alfalfa farms in land that they own or lease, and that they're using, millions of acre feet of groundwater to raise alfalfa to export to Saudi and Chinese dairies. This is an amazing thing. What's your view of that, John? I know when you heard about that, you were flabbergasted by that.
Well, right now, with the big argument of trade and tariffs and taxes, et cetera, between countries and whatnot, the part that has gone under the radar screen is the question, how much of a groundwater trade deficit is being created daily, like from farms that are shipping hay over to the Saudi Arabians, the Chinese, and so on like that. It's a trade deficit. And somewhere down the road, the grandchildren are going to be saying, you never got a penny for the water you used to produce the food that was sent over to some other part of the world. And the other side of the trade deficit, there's a trade surplus. Like people in Saudi Arabia are getting a trade surplus in groundwater because they're getting products raised in groundwater that they didn't cost them a penny of their groundwater.
In other words, the cost of our water is not part of the price structure of what they're getting.
Not whatsoever. It's not even considered.
So the U.S. gives up that value of water, but the recipients receive that value in the form of cheaper prices. And I understand from a activist on a board of supervisors in Western Arizona, Holly Irwin, La Paz County Board of Supervisors, that county in Western Arizona that borders California. I understand from her that they also got the land very cheap as well as the water basically for free. So that's something that confirms what you're saying. At any rate, what are the prospects, John, in your mind for, at this critical juncture as we see these cities talking about groundwater shortages and general water shortages? What are the prospects for recovering what was once, a up and running business, that technology? What are the prospects for getting the closed system that recycles the water and saves, I think you told me, saves about 90% compared to an open fisheries system? What are the prospects for getting that closed water system back online to where we can prevent a bunch of problems? Is it looking rather bleak right now, or do you see this as an opportunity?
Well, it will definitely be an opportunity if we can get the attentions of the politicians, the political parties, and the public at large, and then we can get a greater debate going. But the bigger problem is that nobody's listening, and now we're at the beginning of a demand for closed systems to remove the cages from the oceans and whatnot, and yet nobody can grasp the whole big footprint of fish farms. We have the grow facilities, and then we have the hatchery facilities, and the hatchery facilities is totally unknown to 99.9% of the people. And in so many ways, that footprint is as big as, if not bigger, than the grow-up facilities and their polluting factor. So yeah, education but more importantly, is some type of a reply to what we've been saying here. I kind of chuckle because after being robbed by the money manager and then the government destroying the little bait and tackle shop, we do offer something to the public, and that is, I was president of Coldwater Fisheries and conceived and built the place, and I got thinking, maybe somebody could use me for a consultant. But as soon as I say that, everybody's going to say, "Oh, you're in this for personal gain." Well, that isn't the case. I mean, we realize our station in life and whatnot, but we also have a purpose to tell people we got to get our act together about preserving groundwater.
And what did MPP Randy Hillier tell you about the Abitibi court ruling regarding land ownership under NAFTA?
Well, this takes you right to the Fisherman's Cove story. And the bottom line is there was a court ruling under NAFTA that protected U.S. corporations, and disturbance and damages have to be addressed in any expropriation. Now, I asked the question, if Fisherman's Cove had been owned by a U.S. corporation or a U.S. individual, then all of a sudden, according to NAFTA, the Ontario government would have to address disturbance and damages, that being demolish and rebuild the building on the property not expropriated. But because we're Canadians and Canadians have no protection of property rights, protection of intellectual property included, we are totally ignored.
In other words, you're in your own country and you cannot be reimbursed for damages. But if you were an American corporation or an American individual and that same thing had happened to Fisherman's Cove, you would have been reimbursed.
That's according to Randy Hillier. And the amusing part of this is Randy Hillier is one of the big advocates of property rights. But as best I can understand, I don't think Randy's tried to introduce any legislation in law that would parallel the NAFTA legislation. Only this new legislation would protect Canadian property owners as well as Americans.
Very interesting. That really shows how twisted the North American Free Trade Agreement can be in many respects. And I would begin to summarize this issue, John, by noting that from what I've seen and objectively looking at this and having spoken to you many a times, that if we had the closed recycling system that would use so much less groundwater than the common open systems and would pollute so much less, practically not at all, and if that were in place along with getting a little bit more equity from people like Nestle, where they do not get the groundwater so cheaply and have such leverage in the market, among other things like the rather suspicious operations going on with the Saudi Arabian and Chinese alfalfa farms in Arizona and California and such drought-prone areas. If these things were ironed out and reoriented in a proper fashion, then what I've gathered is three things would happen in terms of solutions. We would prevent the overnetting of fish in the wild. We would prevent the overmining of groundwater, and that could go hand in hand with cutting back on fracking. And we would correct grave imbalances in the food chain. And yet, to this day, you're still being stonewalled as you try to solve these problems.
Well, yeah, and to this day, each hatchery in Ontario and probably all across North America is consuming approximately 2.8 million gallons of groundwater a day. And our technology can reduce that by 90%. Now, we've discovered also in our travels, there's some science out now in regards to a food additive that will reduce the ammonia in fish excretion. And that was the only problem we had for not getting better than 90%. We always had to bring in 10% makeup water to reduce the ammonia so it didn't burn the gills from the fish. If you don't have ammonia in water, as the science community is starting to discover, then you could move the recycling up to 99%. And that gets really, really significant in a grow closed system, which we don't have right now. All the hatchery closed system is the only one because it's going to require a lot of water to be moved around, but not necessarily a lot of water pumped into the aquifer.
That's fascinating. I mean, that kind of savings combined with the improvement in water quality, very hard to argue with that. I mean, that's responsible stewardship. We hear about environmental issues like climate change that are more nebulous, worth looking at, yes, but more nebulous, and it's all about the atmosphere. But when it comes to our groundwater and our surface waters and our soils, we don't hear much responsible stewardship or environmentalism or land husbandry, these kind of terms. We only hear about the more nebulous matters. What you're talking about is concrete and measurable. And that would seem to separate real environmentalism from pseudo-environmentalism, I would point out. Well, at any rate, John, this has been a very interesting discussion. I'll note another article that ran in your Awakening News, Water Concerns Growing. And this is where you detail, among other things, what's going on with Saudi Arabia's plans to build desalination plants, and there's one shown here, for more than $530 million US dollars on the Red Sea coast. So that's Saudi Arabia's way of responding to the perceived water shortages, huge desalination plants. These are just things I'm pointing out that are very interesting and very informative in your newspaper. And just for an informational thing, we also have the description in your paper, and this is another one to consider. And this explains what the Awakening News is about. I think it's important to bring this out so people get an idea of the flavor of your philosophy. The Awakening News is a nonpartisan, Canada-based news and commentary outlet devoted to the best interests of the citizens of Canada, the U.S., and beyond, focusing on seeking solutions to a wide range of societal problems while recognizing the unique cultures and history of our respective communities, provinces, states, and nations. And I think that sums it up, John. And I want to thank you for being on the show. And here's your contact information that we'll put up on the screen. The website, www.awakeningnews.ca, that's awakeningnews.ca. And anyone that wants to email you can write to lte@awakeningnews.ca. Do you have any final comments or observations on the water issues?
Yeah, I would like to remind the British United Kingdom that apparently what we're reading here, they produce more farm fish than Ontario, or for that matter, Canada. And do they have a groundwater trade deficit? Are they using a closed system in their fish hatcheries? Like that's a lot of water that the UK is putting out to grow fish. And of course, that brings the question in: does the UK have a groundwater trade deficit that they don't even know about?
Well, that could be a good question to ask, and we'll look at that in future endeavors in terms of its relationship with the European Union. Is Britain, is the UK on the deficit side of the aisle, you might say, in terms of producing fish and export and import policies? One thing I understand just in passing is that some 30, 40 years ago, probably more like 40 some years ago, the boundaries in which the UK controlled its waters were something like 10 miles out, and that was reduced. And now foreign fishing trawlers, these trawlers, as you told me, John, scoop up enormous amounts of fish. The trawlers from foreign fisheries, foreign fishing operations can come much closer to the shores of Britain and probably other nations, depending on how these laws have changed. And that would, as I understand it, contribute to the overnetting of fish and the hammering of the food chain and fish supplies, and therefore would raise the price of that source of protein.
Yeah, for example, the netting of bait fish, some of which is fed to the farm fish, and it takes 3 pounds of ocean bait fish to raise 1 pound of farm fish on land. So there's a continuous draw on bait fish in the ocean, and a lot of biologists are saying it's in a crisis situation.
In other words, you have a preponderance of game fish and a deficit of bait fish, correct?
And growing. Because the governments, the provinces and the states here, to hatch fish to put in the lakes and streams is all game fish, pretty much all game fish. So they're expecting Mother Nature to create more bait fish to feed the ever-growing number of game fish. Doesn't work.
And that's not going to happen, and that upsets the food chain. Well, very interesting, John. Thanks for being with me on this second episode of Stop the Presses. And this brings to light, ladies and gentlemen, a issue that is rarely heard across the media spectrum. And we'll be talking to John Devine more in the future about this and other issues. Thanks a lot, John.
Thank you very much.
And you've watched the second episode of Stop the Presses, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mark Anderson. We'll see you on the next round.